Hello, everyone. I am buzzing with excitement because we are going to do something very new here on Frag Friends. We all have different levels of experience in perfume and perfume making and perfume development. And really, it was just a matter of time until we decided we're just going to make one ourselves. So we thought it would be really fun to sort of document that process, really give our viewers sort of an inside look at what it takes to make a fragrance and creatively develop it just as much as technically develop it. So this is going to be part of a series where we do just that, and we'll release it in several parts. So Nicola, you're the person who has worked with brands before to develop scents. So you are going to be working with us to develop this scent as well. So tell us about where you're sending us, what sort of creative journey you're putting us on here.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot to think about when creating a fragrance, and I think it's probably fair to say that what we want to convey is as close to the process that I've gone through with individuals and brands as we possibly can, so that our viewers will get a real sense of what that's like. So this is genuinely how I take people who come to me and they want me to design a fragrance for them. And this is genuinely how I approach that project. Being a bit of a slideshow person, I've put together like it's kind of like an info pack and also a slideshow for you guys. And yeah, so with this fragrance brief that I've put together for you guys, I wanted to balance abstraction and real. So I wanted to give you a bit of a structure, but I wanted to cement that. I wanted to give you a structure, but I wanted it to be fluid enough that if you've got a pet ingredient that you're loving at the minute or something about it really speaks to you, then you can go off in that direction and that's fine. Um, and of course, we're not operating within some of these limits that other brands have to, bear in mind. So here's my presentation. You ready for this?
Unbelievably so.
Oh, hang on. So can you see that?
Yes. Absolutely.
Lovely. So I've decided to take you somewhere place-based. Now, the reason I've done this is because um, I want to play about with the idea of, is it possible for you guys to get a sense of a place that you haven't been to, but a place that I know really well? Obviously, travel is a big theme in perfume, and it has been for, years and will continue to be. It's a huge source of inspiration. So, because part of what I do is in helping people communicate ideas, I guess I wanted to test myself. I wanted to see if I could convey enough ideas about this place to translate that to you guys who have never been to this place. Now, when I tell you where it is, you're both gonna go, "Oh yeah, I've got there on my holidays every year," but I don't think you have. You've neither of you have ever mentioned it. So, um, and I want to see if together we can come up with a sort of not a slavish facsimile, but a kind of in that space between our imaginations. I want to see where we end up and where that what that looks like. So, with that in mind, welcome to Halifax in West Yorkshire. Now, one of the things that annoys me about well, no, it doesn't annoy me. I can totally understand it, but I suppose it frustrates me a little bit sometimes, is that the places that perfume takes us to are always really sexy, imagined places. They're places like Rio and New York and
Yes.
Marrakesh, and we're always places that have a kind of an extrovert personality, a larger than lifeness. The places that you've seen in the movies and on TV, and I wanted to take us somewhere much more humble, much more unassuming. And the reason I picked Halifax is where it's where I grew up and spent the first 20-ish years of my life. And I know you guys have not been.
Yes, I have
So
not. I have not done.
so this is Halifax. It's a mid-size northern English town. It had, it's been around for about 1,000 years though, at least, possibly longer. There's evidence of a Bronze Age hill fort there, but we know it's existed for at least 1,000 years. Um, in the 15th century, it became a massive economic hub for the region around the production of wool. We grow a lot of sheep because a lot of the land is not suitable for arable farming. There's a lot of sheep. Um, so wool and wool production followed as a result because there's a lot of water and rivers so that they could spin and turn everything, turn this fleece into wool. During the Industrial Revolution, it became a massively thriving mill town. The name means either clearing or meadow, which I thought might be something that you could work in, or area of coarse grass in the nook of the land, which I've survived as well. Um, it's got a really interesting history as Halifax. It's not always been a particularly happy place or an easy to live place. They had a gibbet there. And a gibbet like a kind of a form of a guillotine, basically. And there's a street in Halifax called Gibbet Street, which is just there's something really sort of Anglo-Saxon about the word gibbet. It's really like it's quite a guttural sounding word. But the gibbet was last used in 1650, apparently. And a little bit of poetry for you. So John Taylor, in his Beggar's Litany, said, "From Hull, from Halifax, from hell, 'tis thus. From all these three, good Lord, deliver us." And it would just like punishment was, law was very harsh in Halifax. Punishment was very harsh. It was a hard place to live. But then you get random things like Halifax Minster. So there's a minster there, like as in a cathedral. But it's tiny. I've been to it's just like a church. It's not grand, it's not imposing. It's quite small. But the first organist there discovered the planet Uranus. So like the random fact. Um, the river there's the River Calder. We had Anne Lister, who was one of the most famous people to have lived there. Considered one of the first modern pioneers of LGBTQ plus culture. So there's all sorts of stuff there. So let me take you to Halifax a bit more. This photo is actually of Halifax during the Industrial Revolution, and it had these dark, satanic mills that clattered day and night, producing cloth. Dean Clough was at one point the largest mill in the world of its type, just in Halifax, just the largest mill of its type in the world. It's still there, and now it's like offices and businesses. You can see a lot of the mill complexes would have been belching out smoke. A lot of the houses and buildings there are stained by this smoke. Even today, and so you get this kind of these black buildings that fit in quite well with the millstone grit landscape and the heather. And there's something I always think there's something really cozy about West Yorkshire. It is very like hills and valleys, and you feel quite protected there because the hills rise up all the way around you. So so this is approximately what it looked like during the Industrial Revolution, and I can almost hear the clatter of the looms and the spinning that's going on and the bustle of the people. Above Halifax is Beacon Hill. Now this is obviously where there's a beacon. There's evidence that there was a Bronze Age hill fort there. The beacon gets lit or has been lit, and it's quite a historical thing at times of warning, at times of celebration. In 1588, it warned of the Spanish Armada, things like that. So I wondered if that was something that might be worked into your composition. But it's, also you kind of get this lovely bird's eye view of the whole valley, which is nice too. Um, this is a place called the Peace Hall, which is where the merchants would take their pieces, literal pieces of cloth to sell. And you can see the size of it. It's absolutely massive. I spent many Saturday afternoons of my misspent youth wandering around shops here because, like, all those little archways and windows are now shops, and they certainly were in my teenage years. Recently, it's been done up, as you can see from this photo, and it's now a venue space as well as like there's cafes and restaurants. But yeah, back in the day, it was where all the merchants went to sell their cloth. Um, so I imagine that there's quite an interesting scent there, from that, that kind of wool and that sort of thing. Cotton. It's like wool, cotton, and carpets. They were the things that, Halifax did quite a lot of. So yeah, wool I think would be a really interesting accord to include in this composition. But then I wanted to give you a sense of it's not just all, dark mills anymore. A lot of the mills have gone. If they're still there, they've been converted to something else. But it's set in this beautiful context. This is like the edge of the South Pennines, the moors. We get a lot of heather, scrubby grass, and this light, obviously it's like it's a photograph that is, showing particular light, but actually that ambery light is something that I associate with that area, and beautiful big sunsets over hillsides is definitely something. It's also quite a, reasonably green valley. There's a lot of industry there and building there, but it is also quite green. Um, but I think heather would be something that's nice to work in to the composition as well. Um, and yeah, you can see that the landscape is primarily made up of millstone grit, but that breaks down to this really sandy soil. So I didn't know if there was something sort of sandy there, maybe. Um, I love being up on the moors, that sort of um, fresh air that almost feels at times like alpine air. Um, it feels healthful and yeah, just invigorating. It's lovely. Um, and then yeah, so here's more millstone grit water, but not sort of like seaweedy water, peaty, boggy on top of the moors. That in the background, I think that's so there's Studley Pike and Studley Royal, I think it's called. There's these two monuments that are just up on the hillside, a little bit further down the valley from Halifax. And I think they're if somebody's gonna correct me on this, but if I'm right, I think Studley Pike particularly is a monument to the Napoleonic Wars. And it's quite an interesting place. You can go up it and look round, and it's really cool. Um, but just one of these like industrial follies almost, that kind of in the industrialists, they had a lot of money and they built these crazy follies. There's another folly in the town. Well, that's more of a, Sudley Pike's more of a monument than a folly, but in the town there's a folly called Warehouse Tower. And it's this massive tower, it's bonkers, that was originally built to be the chimney for a dye works. Um, I think like 1871, something like that. And partway through its construction, the dye works was sold to a different owner, and the new owner refused to pay for the chimney to be fully completed. So it never operated as a chimney, and now it's just this massive tower stands above the town, and that you can go up on bank holidays.
Wait, it's just
And there's loads of stuff. The more I looked into Halifax, the more I thought that's bonkers. And there was an incident in the 1930s where there was this kind of episode of mass hysteria apparently, where they thought there was a serial killer called it was like the Halifax slasher or something like that. And then they realised that several of the victims had been doing it to themselves. So I don't know whether they actually killed anybody, but they said it was just this crazy mass hysteria thing. So yeah, lots of really interesting stuff went on there. Between Halifax and one of the next towns over, or the town over in the next valley, is this thing called the Magna Via. which is the Great Way, and it's this really well, the bit of it that's in Halifax is called Dark Lane, which I think is really cool. Very, very ancient trackway, leading from one town to the next. It was a pack horse route. Not much of it survives now, apparently, but you can still walk what is. And it from what I've been able to tell from my research, it's very like enclosed, very overgrown lanes that feel very like dark and mysterious.
Sort of like a Gustave Doré kind of like Sleeping Beauty almost sort of
Yeah,
thing. Yeah.
yeah, a little bit more sinister, perhaps.
Okay.
And then toffee and chocolate. So, Macintosh set up a toffee making business in the town, became phenomenally successful. He then, well, his I think it was his son sold that business on, and it merged with Roundtree's to become Roundtree Macintosh. And my grandma worked there when she was a young woman, apparently. And then Roundtree Macintosh itself became absorbed within Nestle. So there's actually a long history of sweet confections being made there. And I thought we've talked a lot about, these kind of dark ideas. It might be quite fun to put something like toffee or chocolate in there. I'm quite interested in cacao as a ingredient at the moment. And I'm noticing quite a lot of that coming through in really quite interesting perfumes. So I thought that might be something, that might be an avenue to explore. And then spices, like bringing us to the present for a moment. Halifax is home of the largest workers' cooperative in the UK, which is a company called Sumer Whole Foods. And I know them because they supply lots and lots of really lovely spices. And I thought it might be fun to juxtapose that past Halifax with the dark satanic mills, with the kind of past Halifax with the chocolate, with the present Halifax with this kind of multicultural feel. Thought that might be quite interesting. And then coal. So Anne Lister, who I touched on before, she had a lot of coal mining interests in the area. So is that something that might be quite an interesting thing to explore? And what might that smell like, and what angle might that add? So then to kind of recap it for you, so notes I would suggest are things like smoke, wool, heather, stone or sand, toffee or chocolate, spices and coal. And then I like to put words to that as well. So mysterious, dark, ancient, moody. With Halifax, it always feels like something that's grown out of the ground. It's quite industrial, but it doesn't feel, it's not glass and chrome industrial. It's got this quite like kind of gnarly industrial feel. A bit steampunky, I suppose. Thrilling, something that's a little bit dangerous and something that's quite secretive as well. So I shall stop sharing and back to you guys. What do you think?
Well, I just want to say, first of all, that was incredibly well researched and documented and illustrated, and I'm deeply impressed. So thank you for that. It's really good.
I might have
And
got a
also,
little carried away.
no, not at all. So that's extremely helpful. Just the structure and everything was great. I mean, I'm not even responding emotionally to all that because there's tons to say there, but I really appreciate the fact that you've set us up very well, just structurally, by kind of walking through a story, an intention, and then even going down to like some suggested notes. So that alone structurally, I think is great. But that's my first thing to say. But Adam, you jump in here.
Yeah, no, diving in, like it gives me so many ideas for how to set this fragrance up in terms of its structure. When we think about all these like smoky, coarsely textured elements, like it does start to make me wonder, well, how do we balance that? How do we make that into a perfume that people might want to put on their skin? And I'm not saying that it has to be the prettiest thing in the world, but it has to, it should balance that initiative And so my my thoughts were sort of cleared when you started talking about toffee and chocolate. It gave me some ideas for how we can bring balance to the composition. Um, it obviously, the presentation conjured many questions in my mind. Um, I love the idea of portraying meadow and portraying those cliffy, hilly vegetation that you were talking about. But one question I have: you spent so much time in that area. I've never even stepped foot in England. So my question is, what does heather smell like? I've always wondered.
Um, it's delicately floral, quite dry. I suppose the closest thing that I could equate it to would be like a very dry violet, um, like
Oh,
scrubby, herbaceous, um, a little bit like, a kind of hay smell. Um,
I was
yeah,
gonna say it's got, I mean, from my memory of heather, it's got that slightly coumarin, like that touch of
yeah,
coumarin, a type of smell, and, it's like a little bit like a smell of straw, and I was thinking like straw flowers. It's very delicate, but kind of persistent smell as well too. Yeah, it's very lovely in a soft, kind of way.
yeah.
That's my memory of it. Yeah.
And, of course, these are just suggestions, like, just to start you off. If you don't like any of them, that's fine. Just feel free to discard that bit.
Right.
well, it also makes me think like, if this is a perfume of place, then we have to establish it as English, right? And and there are ways to do that structurally in fragrance that, even people who like me who haven't actually stepped foot in the country can do that, and signify, Englishness, but then use more specific, textures and references and notes to zoom in to that
I'm sorry, I'm
area.
just laughing of you coming up with some stereotypes like, a little bit of tea and a little bit.
Well,
Oh, it's
fair,
no,
but no,
sorry.
although parts of the tea accord, like the tannic part of tea,
Mm.
aligns very well with like the coarse textures Nicola was describing. But
Mm.
I was referring more so to, um, well, English perfumery is like we think about, violet leaf and violet, and we think about,
Mm.
things like black currants and those like pseudo fougères. I'm not saying that this
I know what
fragrance
you sure.
is
Right.
like that,
Right.
but those vetiver, the green Irish tweed kind of notion, like
Yeah, you don't think of these
I think people
crazy
align that
tropical
with
deep type structures or something, and yeah, right.
no,
Yeah, yeah.
no, we think of like that rainy day fragrance appropriately enough. And I'm not saying that this fragrance should smell like that, but if we can conjure England generally and then zoom in with these details, to that are specific to this area of the country, I think that, can help signify this to a broader audience. Um, that's where my mind goes. But you know, materials, John. You have the among the three of us, you have the most technical experience with perfumery materials. I'm curious to know if any sort of individual materials stick out because in your mind after hearing all this, because a few came to mind for me.
It's well, one before I quite get to that, there was just a couple, a few little notes I wanted to mention that I think are interesting about this whole setup. What I like about your presentation, Nicola, is it reminds me of there were these two perfumers that were working out on the West Coast. I'm not sure if they're making perfume anymore in the U.S. That they were doing sort of I guess you could almost call it like historical antique type perfuming. But one thing that they used to do that was interesting is they would make perfume of a certain age. Like they'd say, okay, we're going to make a perfume as it would have been made in like 1910. So they'd look at the materials available to them at that stage. And one of the things that they did in one perfume is they were recreating like a picnic at a certain place. And they did this fascinating thing where they added this very, very tiny, delicate smoke note. And it was based on the idea that where you'd sort of picnic in this certain place, there was just enough of like, like the the smoke coming from locomotives from way off in the city that was starting to filter through into the countryside by that point in time, that it was becoming part of the environment, but not the way it does like in today's landscape, right? So what I thought was kind of interesting was that I was most moved by what you were saying about that black, like, tons of soot that's permeated the brick over time.
Mm.
So it seems like you've got a lot of these smells that have like the volume levels are very different,
Mhm.
like things are probably very subtle and soft because they've just permeated and they're more like historic. And that volume is maybe much softer than something that could be potentially much higher. So I wonder if we'd have a lot of fun playing with levels
Mhm.
here, you know, um, to use more of a sound metaphor. Um, so you've got some great elements and I could see trials here of like, let's put that toffee up or let's bring bring that heather down, or something that
Yeah.
that could be fascinating. Very,
How
very interesting. Very
how do you
interesting.
both feel about wool? Because it has
Yeah,
what what interests me about the smell of wool is that,
yeah. Well,
um, the
this,
idea of a wool blanket and
yeah.
how it is like, it's, I suppose, slightly animalic, but it's also slightly fatty. That lanolin smell is slightly fatty. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I was really drawn to that as when you brought wool up, I thought, oh, this is interesting because wool has like, I mean, in some ways, I mean, I'm not around a lot of sheep, but but what I do find interesting about like the journey of from the sheep to to a sweater, there's a lot of stages in between, but all along it's like you're sort of cleansing it and it's becoming more genteel in the process, right? However, um, i- a lot of times all of the stuff around wool, you're smelling many different things. Like you're smelling bits of the countryside, you're smelling the lanolin, which a lot of that gets removed, but in by the end, but you still, in some cases, you still have some of the lanolin left in there. You're also smelling just like the wind and air that sort of, the sheeps have been living in and all of that. And you're right. I do think it's delicate and it's more of a mixture of sensation and also another interesting thing is like wool traps air. I mean, that's what's so interesting about it. So it tends to like I've read that when you take a wool sweater out of storage, you're actually smelling some of the air of when you put it away, So that's kind of interesting to me too. Um, so that's pretty fascinating. And, like for example, not not very long ago, there is I have not smelled it yet, but I think it's is it Rocote? I don't remember who, but there's a wool absolute that's available now as an ingredient, which I would love to smell specifically for this project to how much does it actually smell like wool? And when you dilute it, what qualities does it have? That could be a pretty interesting kind of separate ingredient. I'd love to work on a wool accord and see what that smells like. To your point, Adam, about ingredients, I'm I'm thinking of like for example, what's so interesting about working with like cacao or cocoa absolute or a cocoa extract or something like that is it's a lovely, lovely material and adds a rich velvety texture and quality to fragrance, which could be wonderful to counteract some of these things which are actually quite cold, like notions of like coal. What was the gritty thing you mentioned in the sort of,
Belgian grit.
yeah, right, which sounds like a mineral type of
Yeah.
texture. Yeah, and um and the watery aspects like of the moors and that sort of pool. There was one shot you showed him sort of like the pool and water, and you mentioned the river and whatnot. And um so yeah, that's one thing. Um what is kind of intriguing about this, Adam, is that there really isn't one big ingredient that's actually like sticking out into right yet, at least to me, of like, oh, this I definitely see, bam, this thing is going to be in here. Um, although, actually, let me take that back a bit, because I could see things like heather and this slightly alpiney air type of thing. Like, don't laugh, but things like a lightly dosed, dihydromercenol, like I think there should be a drop or two of that in here, like that bracing, lavendery, metallic tinged freshness. I think that may end up in the final mix of this. For all the joking we do about dihydromercenol, I could absolutely see that being in here to add that sort of like, kind of like up note, you know. And yeah, lavender actually came to mind as well too, but more not to be used as like a note, but as an element that would like help to create a heather accord and to add that bit of hayish coumarin. So actually lavender hay toward more of like a heather accord. That was something that came to my mind. But there's still a lot of I thinking I got to do. There's also that there's an element that I gotta think about this a bit more. There are a couple of things that are starting to come to my mind now, the more that we're talking through this. But what about yourself, Adam? Anything that's like kind of bubbling up to your head?
Forgive any noise in the background. I think somebody's cutting down a tree, unfortunately. Um, maybe that's appropriate. Industry.
Yeah. Yeah.
The thing that came to my mind first is that I think I don't want to like project or predict anything so early in this like earliest part of the planning stage, but I think it's inevitable that this has to be a very textural fragrance, right? So many of like the things that Nicola was describing were things that I think require, in perfume at least, the note to be like somewhat textural in order to be successfully portrayed. Like it, I think John and I, it seems, both share a strong desire to communicate wool, or at least in one trial of it. And
Yeah.
so I think that's something that, rests on our ability to conjure texture. So there's that. Heather seems like a very textural floral from what you've described. The idea of there being like a very three-dimensional smoky element, again, that relies on like a textural, portrayal, I think. So this is a very textural perfume, I think. And even the balancing act here, if we incorporate a cacao or like a toffee, like rich note to it, that has to be something that smooths things over, I think, a little bit. So yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of playing to be had here with texture. In terms of actual notes, not that I want to get too in the weeds with it this early or for our, viewers' purposes, but there is an element of like that using woody ambers to our advantage, I think. Something like a aldambre is a material that kind of comes to mind. It has like a hot metallic quality and it has an airy quality. So I think maybe we can use that to our advantage to some extent. Things like that would be useful. I also wrote down like something like a tonquitone musk, something like a that lanolin like animalic, but in like that smoothed over, fatty kind of way.
Yeah, that is heavy to me as well. Right.
Some florally materials that have heft to them and can communicate airiness, like carbonol came to mind. I'm
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure that isn't fully restricted. Um, Not that we're necessarily thinking about like IFRA restrictions, but it might be wise to at least consider them. Um, just, ideas of like cloth and linens, like how to portray that. I'm not even sure yet, but um, it, it is something that might be more of a textural element instead of like a literal element, but that will come out in our experimentations. Yeah, those things came to mind. I'm curious, more so than like specific materials, are there any like specific perfumes or specific houses that make perfumes that strike you as inspirations for something like this? And obviously my mind first goes to Joram Studio. I mean, not the least of which is just because they've inspired us, Nicola,
Mm,
individually, but more literally too. I mean, they are veritable experts in notes of uh northern countrysides, and
mm,
flora and fauna are fairly similar where they are at in Scotland. So that there's that to consider. My mind also goes to the House of Marlou. I believe they're a French house that specialize in these three-dimensional musky perfumes, some of which more recently have tackled notes of like linens and like woolly kinds of materials. And then my mind also goes to this brand new fragrance, except I think of it like this is like the opposite of this. So Parfums Cortana's Buter, I actually had it on my desk as we were discussing this. Buter is a very hotel linen fragrance. So I think of this perfume as sort of its spiritual opposite. You know,
mm,
it's the origin site of linens, and the wool itself that goes into the creation of finer fabrics. Where this Cortana perfume is all about the end results of it being very manicured and in these environments of hotels that are very scent oriented themselves, but in a very different way. I think this is like that dark side of what they were conveying there. Though it's definitely going to be an inspiration of how to, you know, set about finding these notes and their origin places.
mm.
Um, can I
I
ask a question? Oh, sorry, Adam.
no, go ahead.
I had a question for you, Nicola. Like, were you, can we ask questions?
Yeah, coach them. Yeah.
What if I were to just ask a couple questions like, how about this? And you can just say, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Or you can say, all right, yeah, but that's not a very Halifax kind of a thing,
Yeah.
like,
Absolutely.
because like, as we're talking through these things, I'm thinking of like, based on these ideas, this thing would be good to add in here. And this is slightly more like the perfume of like a perfume maker talking,
Mm,
but I want to know, is that a really non-Halifax idea?
yep.
You know what I'm
Sure.
saying? Right.
Yeah.
Green apple.
Interesting. Bilberry. Do you have bilberries in America?
Were they like blackberries?
No. So bilberries
Oh,
are
no. Oh, no.
a million miles away.
Oh, okay.
Um, green apple, I don't associate with Halifax. However, bilberries I do. Now, bilberries are like a blueberry, but
Okay.
tiny and really, really tart.
Oh,
And
that's
if you
right.
pick them, so my grandma used to take me bilberrying. Not loads of people. I know Bougie Bougies do. They have a in their Queen Jam, I think the candle's called. There's a bilberry accord in that.
Okay.
And it is a very small, bright. It's sort of blue, but when you get the juice on your fingers, it's purple. It's like blood purple. It's so purple.
Okay.
Tart, fruity. It's not a million miles away from a blackberry in taste. It's not as sweet as a blueberry. Um, much sourer. So you could have that.
Got it. Okay.
Well,
That's
John certainly knows how to create a blueberry accord, so I think that
that
we have
is
a great starting point.
true. I do. So a tartar version of that. Okay, that's good. That's good. All right, good. Because for some reason, this reading list was screaming out like it needs a fruit, like
Yeah.
it needs fruit. But
Gooseberry as well. I think gooseberry and rhubarb. Rhubarb's big round here. We have this like something like 90% of the UK's rhubarb's grown within a 5 mile. It's crazy. Everybody grows rhubarb. And actually, I was thinking the other day. So I have a rhubarb. I'm going to digress about rhubarb now. I've got a rhubarb plant in my garden that I
Yeah.
split from the crown of a rhubarb plant that lived in the garden of my grandma's next door neighbour. I remember this rhubarb plant. It's a specific variety. It's called something like cherry rhubarb.
Uh-huh.
It's meant to have like a cherry note in it.
Uh-huh.
And I remember this plant being there from when I was very, very little, and it wasn't a new plant then. And
Wow.
so I think this plant that I have in my garden now must be over 50 years old. And I just think that's mad, and it's thriving.
Yeah.
My mum's recently said to me, "Can she have a splitting from it?" So I'm just like, that's insane that this, and if you just leave it in one place, it will eventually die. But if you split it and move it somewhere else, it'll carry on. It's like, is this an immortal rhubarb? Quite possibly.
Amazing. I mean, no, I've always, and the thing about rhubarbs, just going off on a tangent, but they always seem to me like prehistoric plants,
Oh,
right?
so prehistoric. Yeah.
Weird,
Yeah.
and like they're just crazy plants. Yeah. Just, yeah. I've always been fascinated by them. My dad loved growing this stuff, and he loved pies made of rhubarb and all that stuff. It's like, yeah. Okay, this is helpful though. This helps because I think maybe even to counteract some of all of the stuff I've been reading here, that it just like I'm feeling like some of the smoke, even the sweetness, the wool, like those are although certain thing. And I just was wondering if in the top, like we're kind of lacking a top note here, is what I'm seeing. And that might be what I was sort of like how does one come out of the gate with Halifax? Or whatever it may be called, rendezvous at Halifax. Or moonlight in Halifax or whatever.
I was just thinking that whenever I have created my own work in perfume before, if I'm being critical about what I've done and like looking critically at my formulas, I realize that I often gravitate towards personality-driven base notes. That is, and I don't mean like base notes as in a pyramid. I just mean like base notes as in how it behaves on skin, how long it lasts, how it behaves. And so the result that I've made is that sometimes my fragrances end up being a little muddy because they are so base and middle note driven, and they lack upper, middle, and top notes that burn off quickly, but do add to the personality of the fragrance. And so sometimes there's like a slight muddiness at the beginning of my work because of that. And I want to make sure that we are layering this in a way that is meaningful to the brief here. I'm curious to know, and this is something that we're going to bear out in our trials, but there's ideas of smokiness, ideas of a musky, coarse and fattiness to communicate like lanolin and material and like fabric materials and wool. These things are, to me, they are created by base heavy materials to some extent. There's going to be some other materials that we use to communicate them that might not last as long, but there's some musks and smokes and woods involved there, I think, and some mineralic qualities as well. And those things tend to last a long time in terms of how they behave on skin. So I'm curious to know how we will communicate those notes with materials that don't just last and last and last, so that we can add a three-dimensional idea to this fragrance. I'm curious to know, Nicola, maybe a loaded question to some extent. Do you have a memory of you said you spent the first 20-something years of your life here? Do you have a memory that sticks out of your time in any of the places you describe that makes you feel maybe more swelled with emotion, or makes you feel like, this is like a precious time for me? maybe it's a sad time, maybe it's a happy time, but it's a precious time. It's a time that it's a moment maybe that makes you feel something.
Mm.
If you feel comfortable with it, I'd love to maybe hear a little more about what you remember from that moment.
Yeah. So my grandma lived in a row of mill workers' cottages, and she lived at one end, and her sister lived at the other end, and there was maybe 8 cottages in a row, just sort of, just outside the centre of Halifax. And one of my most vivid childhood memories is she took me round to her sister's house and sat me on this wall. Now the wall was probably, I don't know, maybe 4 foot, like, off the ground, and I was little, and I remember her picking me up and putting me on this wall. And I sat there with my cousins, and my grandma's sister brought out a dish with ice cream in it and raspberries. Now she had a little bit, she had this like field. It wasn't a field, it was maybe, I don't know, 20 foot of like scrubby grass, but she had some raspberry canes on it. And these raspberry canes, the raspberries they produced weren't big, plump raspberries. They weren't perfect shop raspberries. They were tiny and bitty. And when you picked them, they fell apart. But they were the most intensely raspberry flavour. And they gave me this, I don't know if you had it in the States, but it's ice cream that came in a cardboard box. And yeah, you would peel the cardboard box back, slice a brick of it off. And I remember sitting on this wall, having this ice cream studded with these really raspberry tasting raspberries, and getting the sort of the taste of the cardboard box in the vanilla ice cream and the raspberries, and it just being like this kind of scent collision.
This is
love
very
that.
interesting. I'm hearing a lot of maybe sour or what's the tart notes, tart ideas, and like tart ideas. That sounds like a band. Uh, I it's like a cover band for like barber shop quartets. I don't know. Um, anyway, I I'm getting like notions of like a bittersweet quality to this, where it's nostalgic and cutting, and and it and it sort of describes your day. These are interesting notions that I definitely smelled in perfume before, but I want to maybe revisit some of the fragrances that have made me feel something similar to this. Um, in essence, what I'm hearing from this brief is like textural, coarse, and the word immortal I wrote down.
Hmm.
I don't know if that's going to play into this at all. It seems a bit serious, but maybe that's a good thing. The idea of like history that lingers and moves with you as your life moves, uh, that is interesting to me, and I'd love to be able to express it. I don't know how yet. Um, I I think when we talk about sense, and sense both with a C and without a C, of place, we think about uh like these strong emotional ties that people have with their place. And I know that that's been a big part of your life, Nicola, and it's been a big part of mine. And so I think we can communicate with each other about like the overall meaningfulness of this brief to you. And I think that John and I can both get on your level there. Whether or not we're able to conjure that place is another challenge.
Mm.
How we determine that will be interesting. But you've certainly, as John said before, you've given us plenty to work with.
Good.
Yeah, there's a lot to work with. In fact, I want kind of a bit of a maybe final question for me for this, although I have a lot of questions, so it'll be good to talk more about it. But a helpful, I really believe in boundaries when creating. And sometimes I get lost if I don't have some good solid boundaries put in place.
Mm.
Um, I almost think that there's so many good ideas here that this could be a few perfumes.
Mm.
Um, so, is there it? how do you feel about like at some point might we find ourselves, like, whoa, we've built like 12 accords and we can't, we can't, this is becoming like our attempt at like, the Four Seasons of Halifax, like we're trying to do too
Yeah.
much. And I'm not saying we're there yet, but um do we sort of have permission at some point to say, you know what, we realize we need to just kind of focus on this corner of
Yeah.
the brief, or and you can answer however you want here. Like, are you saying, actually, I really do kind of want you to pick a bit of a kaleidoscopic, like, bits and pieces of all of this? Or can you give me some direction on that?
Yeah, I think I quite like the idea of zooming in on part of the brief. Um, I think the things that, if you to put some boundaries around it, I'm really interested in this smoke idea. I'm really interested in it having wool in it. And I'm really interested in that velvety texture of cacao or cocoa absolute or that sort of thing and how they might come together. Um, I will say that I have planned to throw you a curveball. Now, whether you want that curveball now, I think what I planned to do was give it you after the first modifications, but perhaps it might be. I think maybe it might be better to give it you now. What do you guys think?
Hmm.
I mean, it could completely ruin us, or it could uh, help give us that sense of guidance that we're seeking here.
I wonder, well, I wonder if perhaps the curveball later is going to be interesting as well for our viewers, because and listeners, because they're going to see in real time, like, whoa, what just happened? I mean, like, how are they going to deal with that? Whatever.
Like,
Um,
this is like an echo chain, like a way to describe what perfumers have to do when working with clients and what clients have to do on account of their perfume houses to communicate to perfumers. I think this would illustrate that like last minute change up,
right. Like,
I will save it then.
it could even cause a bit of a row here. We'll be like, I quit. I refuse. I rather like that idea, actually.
Yeah,
Not
okay,
to,
I will save it then.
Yeah.
not to belabor a point, but I'm just curious, like Nicola, you did a lot of like zooming in on different areas of this specific region. When you think about where you grew up and spent so much time in your life, like, do any words particularly stand out to you? Like, just when I ask you for that quick fire rapid association, like word play, what comes to mind for you?
It's things like ancient and mysterious and pagan, and I mean that in the sense of like hidden things, secret knowledge, um, things that have been forgotten, um, but also cozy, that kind of um, gothic, like there's something melancholic and gothic about that place, but also weirdly hopeful at the same time.
Right.
Yeah, lots of words like that, that kind of, yeah, that convey darkness. I will say as well, I really liked your tea idea, Adam, because although I hadn't, um, you know, it is an English trope for a reason. We do drink a lot of tea, and Yorkshire tea is a big, it's a big thing in Yorkshire, and we love Yorkshire tea and we love tea.
And
So
you
I do like
introduced it
that.
to me.
Yeah. Um, and with the smoke, I'm quite keen that it doesn't go barbecuey. Because I really find things that go barbecuey really difficult to like. Um, I think it's often birch tar that does that for me. It's just like, no, it just smells of barbecue.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it
What?
has that no oily. I know what you smoke is a little tricky to do in
Yeah,
things. So.
yeah.
Um. Uh. Okay. I know we're going on quite a bit, but I have another question I had for you. So, I'm looking at some of the words you were just mentioning here, and as a test of success here, often in many things that I do, almost, in fact, all of the things I do, a question that is asked or I asked is, what does success look like?
Mm. I think success will be a wearable perfume
Mhm.
that isn't going to be like disgusting. That isn't gonna just be like a kind of weird mashup where people go, "Oh my god, you smell odd." Um, a wearable perfume that is a conversation starter. And I quite like the idea of us all being able to wear it in our different parts of the globe and have that kind of thread of shared imagining.
Mm, mm,
That's for me. If we can come to a point of shared imagining, where you guys have a sense of this place and I have a sense of this place, because I mean, let's face it, it's all imagined anyway. Because I'm talking about a Halifax of my past and a Halifax of the industrial past, which doesn't exist anymore. So really, none of it's real. Because I'm not talking about going to Halifax now and doing Headspace and going, right, it has to be,
mhm.
the absolute recreation. I'm conveying a place of my imagining, and if the three of our minds can come to that shared agreement, I think that'll be really cool.
Yeah. That's actually really helpful. That's very, very helpful. It is. I like it. Wow. How interesting.
I'm really excited about this. I think this
Yeah,
is
no, really, I'm utterly, utterly excited by it. I totally am. This is fantastic.
Well, I hope everybody who's watching this and has made it this far is intrigued to see part two. We will probably hint at what is to come a little bit later, but right now, what does success look like in part two? I think for me, it means we've come back to record with at least a sketch of an idea in terms of our materials, in terms of a formula. Um, Maybe it's after we've put together a couple of them and compounded a couple small examples of that. Maybe not. Maybe it's when we have sent some samples off to Nicola to smell, or maybe it's just a look inside of our processes, John. Maybe the next step is to capture images and maybe a little video of us actually working on the thing.
That could be right. Exactly. Right. And possibly you or I, yeah, you and I separately saying, I would like to tackle this little piece of something, or kind of doing an assessment of like, here are some great things I think that will be part of what I'm going to be building or something. Yeah. Right.
Perfect. Well, I sincerely hope everybody's interested in this process because I don't think something like this has been done so candidly in the perfume media sphere. So I'm curious to see how our viewers will react to this. And uh, yeah, but my mind is buzzing with ideas, as I'm sure yours is as well, John. So
Yeah.
I can't wait
Absolutely.
to have something to show for it.
Excellent.